What's up, guys? This is Chris from DraftDashboard.com.
Here are my DFS picks for NFL Week 15. Final look.
These picks apply for DraftKings and FanDuel. Before I get started, please drop a like on this video and hit that red subscribe button
And hit that bell icon
so you don't miss our new videos.
In this video, I'm going to go over each position and break down a couple of my favorite players for this NFL DFS main slate. And if you stick around to the very end of this video, we'll use the Draft Dashboard tools to make a DFS lineup using the picks we just made. Okay guys, NFL Week 15. Let's take a look at the quarterback position. So, a couple of studs on the slate that I like this week. I like Kyler Murray from the Arizona Cardinals playing the Detroit Lions, who have the second worst defense overall and they're middle of the pack defending opposing quarterbacks. Kyler Murray has averaged 24.4 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 6.6 rush attempts per game. He's projected at 24.2 fantasy points here in Week 15. He's going to be about 11% owned, and he's $7,900 DraftKings salary, $900 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 47.5 points scored in this game, with the Cardinals favored by 12.5. Now, Kyler Murray's got a healthy DeAndre Hopkins back, and he scored 22 and 31 fantasy points in the last two games, and he had 7 and 10 rush attempts in those games. So he's got a nice rushing floor, a pretty good matchup here this week. So I like Kyler Murray here versus the Detroit Lions. Okay, another stud on the slate that I like is Josh Allen from the Buffalo Bills playing the Carolina Panthers, who have a good defense overall. They've been good versus opposing quarterbacks. Josh Allen has averaged 26 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 6.7 rush attempts per game. He's going to be about 9% owned, projected at 23.4 fantasy points here in Week 15. He's $8,100 DraftKings salary and $600 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 44.5 points scored in this game, with the Bills favored by 12. So Josh Allen, he scored 42, 13, and 29 fantasy points in the last 3 games. And in those games, he had 12, 6, and 8 rush attempts. So the matchup isn't as good as Kyler Murray. He's coming off of a monster game where he scored 42 fantasy points. You just gotta love those rush attempts. A quarterback with a rushing floor, always awesome for fantasy. So I like Josh Allen here versus the Carolina Panthers. Okay, now another stud that I like, you're gonna save some salary with this guy. Take a look at Matthew Stafford from the LA Rams playing the Seattle Seahawks, who have the 9th worst defense overall, and they've been pretty good versus opposing quarterbacks. But Matthew Stafford has averaged 23.4 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 1.9 rush attempts per game. He's going to be about 9% owned, projected at 23.2 fantasy points here tonight. He's $7,000 DraftKings salary. Vegas thinks there's going to be 45.5 points scored in this game, with the Rams favored by 5.5. Now, Matthew Stafford has scored 24, 24, and 27 fantasy points in the last 3 games. So I like that Odell Beckham Jr. is catching touchdown passes. He's much more comfortable in the system, so he's a productive part of the offense now. So I think that's an X factor that Matthew Stafford has. So I like Matthew Stafford here versus the Seattle Seahawks. Okay, now if you want to save some salary and get a quality quarterback in your lineup, take a look at Dak Prescott from the Dallas Cowboys playing the New York Giants, who have the 12th worst defense overall. They're middle of the pack defending opposing quarterbacks. Dak Prescott has averaged 20.8 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 3.1 rush attempts per game. He's going to be about 10% owned, projected at 21 fantasy points here in week 15. He's $6,500 DraftKings salary, $1,000 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 44.5 points scored in this game, with the Cowboys favored by 11. So Dak Prescott has scored 12, and 28 fantasy points in the last 3 games. So he's had a bad couple of weeks in terms of fantasy production. So I am expecting a bounce back game here from Dak Prescott playing the New York Giants. Okay, now if you want to save a ton of salary in your lineup and go with a guy who's got a fantastic matchup and has been pretty productive, take a look at Tua Tagovailoa from the Miami Dolphins playing the New York Jets, who have the absolute worst defense overall. They give up the 4th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Tua Tagovailoa has averaged 16.6 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 3 rush attempts per game. He's going to be about 9% owned, projected at 19.2 fantasy points here in week 15. He's $5,700 DraftKings salary and $1,700 more on FanDuel. Now, Vegas thinks there's going to be 41 points scored in this game, with the Miami Dolphins favored by 9.5. Tua Tagovailoa has scored 18, 13, and 19 fantasy points in the last 3 games, and he got 2, 4, and 3 rush attempts in those games. So he'll rush the ball every once in a while, and this is just a great matchup at a low price tag. So I like Tua Tagovailoa here versus the New York Jets. Okay, everyone, it's time to announce the winner of our $25 weekly PayPal giveaway. And the winner is Drew Johnson. Drew Johnson, congratulations. You're the winner of this week's $25 PayPal giveaway. Please reply to our comment to collect your prize.
Before I continue with the picks, I'm excited today because we added a new contest for everyone watching.
If you want to enter the drawing for $25 PayPal,
all you need to do is like this video, hit that subscribe button, and make a quick comment below to be entered into the drawing. We'll reply to a random comment and let you know that you won.
And we'll send you $25 PayPal.
So it's that easy, and we pick a new winner every Saturday and announce them in our video. So get your comment in now so I can add another entry for you.
Okay, now another quarterback that I like, and this might be my favorite low salary quarterback on the slate. I like Jimmy Garoppolo from the San Francisco 49ers playing the Atlanta Falcons, who have the 4th worst defense overall, and they give up the 2nd most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Jimmy Garoppolo has averaged 17.3 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 2.8 rush attempts per game. He's only going to be about 5% owned, projected at 18.4 fantasy points here in week 15. He's $5,800 DraftKings salary and $900 more on FanDuel. So I like that price on both sites. And Vegas thinks there's going to be 46 points scored in this game, with the 49ers favored by 9.5. So this is a fantastic matchup. And Jimmy Garoppolo scored 20, 18, and 12 fantasy points in the last 3 games. I think he can go for 20 plus fantasy points in this one. So I like the low price tag and the low ownership with the good matchup. He's got all his wide receivers back and good to go. So he's got a lot of weapons he can throw the ball to. So I like Jimmy Garoppolo here versus the Atlanta Falcons. Okay, let's take a look at the running back position. So the stud on the slate that I like, and I'm a little bit surprised with the ownership of this play, I like Joe Mixon from the Cincinnati Bengals playing the Denver Broncos, who have a good defense overall. They're middle of the pack defending opposing running backs. Joe Mixon has averaged 18.8 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 18.9 rush attempts per game and 2.5 pass targets per game. He's only going to be about 4% owned, projected at 16.3 fantasy points here in week 15. He's 7,200 DraftKings salary, 1,100 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 44 points scored in this game, with the Bengals trailing by 3. Now, Joe Mixon has scored 9, 10, and 35 fantasy points in the last 3 games, and he got 18, 19, and 28 rush attempts in those games, on top of 2, 1, and 4 pass targets. So he's getting plenty of volume. I know the past couple of weeks haven't been productive, but this guy's got 30 plus fantasy point upside. If you take out the last 2 weeks, he scored 35, 27, and 28 fantasy points. So I think this is a good opportunity to get a low ownership and low salary Joe Mixon in your lineup, a guy that can absolutely blow the doors off of the defense. So I like Joe Mixon here versus the Denver Broncos. Okay, now this is a pick that I like. Granted, he's going to be healthy and good to go. He's practicing in a limited fashion, but if he is good to go with no limitations, I like James Conner from the Arizona Cardinals playing the Detroit Lions, who have the 3rd worst defense overall. They give up the 2nd most fantasy points to opposing running backs. James Conner has averaged 17 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 13.8 rush attempts per game and 2.4 pass targets per game. He's going to be about 14% owned, projected at 14.6 fantasy points here in week 15. He's 6,400 DraftKings salary, 1,600 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 47.5 points scored in this game, with the Cardinals favored by 12.5. So fantastic matchup. This could be a running game script if the Cardinals take the lead in this game. So he could get a bunch of rush attempts in this one. Granted, he's going to be healthy and good to go. He scored 34, 19, and 21 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 13, 20, and 21 rush attempts on top of 9, 2, and 6 pass targets. So tons of volume, tons of production. Love the matchup. So I like James Conner if he's going to be healthy and not going to be limited in this game here versus the Detroit Lions. Okay, another running back that I like is Antonio Gibson from the Washington football team playing the Philadelphia Eagles, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall. They're middle-of-the-pack defending opposing running backs. Antonio Gibson has averaged 14 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 16.6 rush attempts per game and 2.9 pass targets per game. He's going to be about 9% owned, projected at 14.3 fantasy points here in week 15. He's 6,000 DraftKings salary, and Antonio Gibson has scored 5, 22, and 27 fantasy points in the last 3 games, up of 10, 23, and 29 rush attempts, on top of 2, 6, and 7 pass targets. So he had an off game last game, just didn't get a lot of touches, but I expect him to get plenty of touches in this one. So I like Antonio Gibson here versus the Philadelphia Eagles. Okay, now if you want to save some salary at the running back position, you could go with a guy like Sony Michel from the LA Rams playing the Seattle Seahawks, who have the 9th worst defense overall. They give up the 3rd most fantasy points to opposing running backs. But you know what? Sony Michel, I'm just not a big fan of Sony Michel. he got 20 rush attempts last game, only put up 8 fantasy points. I know he had 25 fantasy points the game before that with 24 rush attempts. So, I mean, he could get it done for you, and maybe he does in this matchup. He's 5,800 DraftKings salary, going to be about 21% owned. I'm just not feeling Sony Michel. I'm a Patriots fan, so I remember Sony Michel and the Patriots, and he's just not all that impressive most of the time. So I think there's a lot of risk with this pick, but I don't mind him here because of the low price tag and the matchup. I think that ownership is way too high, but I don't mind Sony Michel here versus the Seattle Seahawks. A guy that I would much rather play and save a couple $100 here is Myles Gaskin from the Miami Dolphins playing the New York Jets, who have the absolute worst defense overall, and they give up the absolute most fantasy points to opposing running backs. Myles Gaskin has averaged 12.3 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 11.9 rush attempts per game and 4.3 pass targets per game. He's going to be about 17% owned, projected at 13.8 fantasy points here in Week 15. He's 5,600 DraftKings salary and 1,000 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 41 points scored in this game, with the Dolphins favored by 9.5. So the matchup doesn't get any better. This is probably going to be a running game script. I could see Myles Gaskin easily getting 20 plus touches in this one, and he scored 7, 19, and 19 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 15, 16, and 23 rush attempts on top of 2, 2, and 4 pass targets. So I like Myles Gaskin here versus the New York Jets. Okay, and another low salary running back that I like on the slate this week in a great matchup is James Robinson from the Jacksonville Jaguars playing the Houston Texans, who have the 3rd worst defense overall. They give up the 2nd most fantasy points to opposing running backs. James Robinson has averaged 13.3 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 11.9 rush attempts per game and 3.3 pass targets per game. He's going to be about 31% owned, projected at 15.1 fantasy points here in Week 15. He's 5,400 DraftKings salary, 900 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 39.5 points scored in this game, with the Jacksonville Jaguars favored by 5.5. So great matchup here. So I like James Robinson here versus the Houston Texans.
Real quick, guys, I got great news. For a limited time, we're offering a full 30-day trial to DraftDashboard. You can try all the tools for NFL, MLB is still going, NBA is right around the corner. This is a great time to get in and try everything for 1 month. The tools are all about saving research time. You can see the last 3 games, the fantasy points per game, the targets they got per game, so you can see how involved they are in the offense, the rushes they got per game. Seeing all this stuff on one screen helps you save time and make better picks. Oh, and if you're tired of doing research every day, we just added a cheat sheet that shows hand-picked plays for the slate. No confusing stat lines, no headaches, just a simple cheat sheet that shows the absolute best players for your lineups.
Okay, let's take a look at the wide receiver position. I don't need to tell you about these guys. The studs on the slate, Cooper Kupp and Davante Adams. Both of these guys are expensive. Cooper Kupp is 9,000 DraftKings salary. Davante Adams is 8,900 DraftKings salary. But they both have monster upside, 30 plus fantasy point upside. And Cooper Kupp got 15 pass targets last week. Davante Adams got 13 pass targets last week. Just monster volume. Cooper Kupp's going to be about 37% owned, and Davante Adams is going to be about 15% owned. So those are the studs on the slate. Now, another stud on the slate that I like is Stephon Diggs from the Buffalo Bills playing the Carolina Panthers, who have a good defense overall, and they've been good versus opposing wide receivers. Stephon Diggs
has averaged 17.2 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 9.4 pass targets per game. He's on the field for 82% of the snaps, going to be about 23% owned, projected at 17.8 fantasy points here in week 15. He's 7,700 DraftKings salary, 100 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 44.5 points scored in this game, with the Bills favored by 12. Stephon Diggs has scored 14, 9, and 20 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 13, 7, and 9 pass targets. So I like Stephon Diggs here versus the Carolina Panthers. Now another guy that gets a ton of passing volume is Deontay Johnson from the Pittsburgh Steelers playing the Tennessee Titans, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, but they give up the second most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Deontay Johnson has averaged 19.2 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 10.8 pass targets per game. He's on the field for 89% of the snaps, going to be about 17% owned, projected at 17.8 fantasy points here in week 15. He's 7,500 DraftKings salary, 300 less on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 43 points scored in this game, with the Steelers favored by 1.5. Deontay Johnson has scored 15, 34, and 19 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 10, 11, and 14 pass targets. So monster volume, excellent production, and a good matchup. So I like Deontay Johnson here versus the Tennessee Titans. Okay, another wide receiver that I like. Now, I actually like all of the wide receivers, or all the top wide receivers for the Dallas Cowboys: CeeDee Lamb, Amari Cooper, and Michael Gallup. So I like all 3 of these guys. CeeDee Lamb is going to be about 7% owned. He's 7,400 DraftKings salary. Amari Cooper is going to be about 8% owned, and he's 6,400 DraftKings salary. So I like the salary savings there on Amari Cooper, who scored 16 fantasy points off of 7 pass targets last week, and CeeDee Lamb had 15 fantasy points off of 10 pass targets. So I like CeeDee Lamb and Amari Cooper here versus the New York Giants. Okay, now if you want to save some salary in your lineup at the wide receiver position, take a look at Brandon Cooks from the Houston Texans playing the Jacksonville Jaguars, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall. They're middle-of-the-pack defending opposing wide receivers. Brandon Cooks has averaged 14.3 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 8.4 pass targets per game. He's going to be about 10% owned. He's on the field for 87% of the snaps, projected at 13.8 fantasy points here in week 15. He's 5,800 DraftKings salary, 1,100 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 39.5 points scored in this game, with the Texans trailing by 5.5. So could be a passing game script for the Texans. And Brandon Cooks has scored 21, 8, and 14 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 11, 6, and 5 pass targets. So he's been pretty good most of the season. So I like Brandon Cooks here versus the Jacksonville Jaguars. Okay, now you want to come down in salary here. I think a guy you got to look at is Devontae Parker from the Miami Dolphins playing the New York Jets. And this is mostly due to the fact that their top wide receiver, they got Allen Hurns, who's out, but there's also another wide receiver on this team. Jalen Waddle is going to be out as well. So that's going to open up a lot of passing volume for Devontae Parker from the Miami Dolphins playing the New York Jets, who have they have the absolute worst defense overall. They've been good versus opposing wide receivers, and Devontae Parker has averaged 12.5 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 8 pass targets per game. So he's been on the field for 100% of the snaps, and he's going to be about 40% owned. So big ownership, but for good reason. He's projected at 13.8 fantasy points here in week 15, and he is only 4,300 DraftKings salary, 1,500 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 41 points scored in this game, with the Dolphins favored by 9.5. So that price tag is just way too low. And Devontae Parker scored 11 and 17 fantasy points in the last 2 games off of 5 and 11 pass targets. And that was with Jalen Waddle on the field. So without Jalen Waddle, I think he's going to get a ton of pass targets here and probably my favorite wide receiver play on the slate. So I like Devontae Parker here versus the New York Jets. Okay, let's take a look at the tight end position. So right around that same line of thinking, a guy that should probably get a bunch of pass targets in this game, take a look at Mike Gesicki from the Miami Dolphins playing the New York Jets, who have the absolute worst defense overall. They give up the 7th most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. Mike Gesicki has averaged 10.8 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 6.9 pass targets per game. He's going to be about 21% owned, projected at 12.2 fantasy points here in week 15, and he's 5,000 DraftKings salary and 1,200 more on FanDuel. He scored 12 fantasy points last week off of 11 pass targets, and I expect him to get a ton of volume here in this game. So I like Mike Gesicki here versus the New York Jets. Another tight end that I like is Dallas Goedert from the Philadelphia Eagles playing the Washington football team, who have the 6th worst defense overall, and they're middle of the pack defending opposing tight ends. And Dallas Goedert has averaged 10.8 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 4.7 pass targets per game. He's going to be about 8% owned, projected at 11.4 fantasy points here in week 15. He's 5,300 DraftKings salary. Now, Dallas Goedert scored 32 fantasy points last week off of 6 pass targets. So I like Dallas Goedert here versus the Washington football team. Okay, now if you want to save a bunch of salary at the tight end position, take a look at James O'Shaughnessy from the Jacksonville Jaguars playing the Houston Texans, who have the 3rd worst defense overall. They give up the 5th most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. James O'Shaughnessy has averaged 6.3 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 5.2 pass targets per game. He's been on the field for 100% of the snaps, going to be about 8% owned, projected at 7.2 fantasy points here in week 15. And I like this pick because he's only 3,200 DraftKings salary, 1,400 more on FanDuel. Now, he hasn't been super productive the past 3 weeks, only scoring 6, 3, and 8 pass targets, but he is getting the volume. He got, only scoring 6, 3, and 8 fantasy points, but he got 6, 6, and 5 pass targets in that game. So a guy that's going to get 5 to 6 pass targets for only 3,200, I think that's a pretty good value play and a great matchup. So I like James O'Shaughnessy here versus the Houston Texans. And another value play here at the tight end position is Gerald Everett from the Seattle Seahawks playing the LA Rams. Gerald Everett has averaged 7.6 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 4.2 pass targets per game. He's going to be about 8% owned, projected at 8.3 fantasy points here in week 15. And he scored 11, 3, and 15 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 2, 6, and 9 pass targets. So only 2 pass targets last game, but he did turn that into 11 fantasy points and 6 and 9 pass targets the games before that. So pretty decent volume when you average it out. So I like Gerald Everett here versus the LA Rams. And another tight end that I think looks pretty decent on this slate is Dawson Knox from the Buffalo Bills playing the Carolina Panthers. Dawson Knox has averaged 12.9 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 5.1 pass targets per game. He's on the field for 84% of the snaps, going to be about 4% owned, projected at 10.8 fantasy points here in week 15. He's $5,100 DraftKings salary, $1,400 more on FanDuel, and he scored 19, 3, and 18 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 9, 6, and 3 pass targets. So I like Dawson Knox here versus the Carolina Panthers.
If you want to try all these daily fantasy tools for yourself, click the link in the description below this video or just go to DraftDashboard.com. You can use our DFS lineup optimizer to build quality lineups using our picks and your own custom player pool. Click the link in the description below this video and try all these daily fantasy tools right now. Thanks so much for watching. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel and hit that bell icon so you can get instant updates whenever we post a new video.
Thank you so much for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, please smickety smash that like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Oh, and please comment below with your favorite player for this NBA slate. I love to hear what you guys have to think. Thanks again, and good luck.